Gender perspective on development. Contents. 11.1 Introduction. 11.2 The concept of gender. 11.3 Women, Gender and Development. 11.4 Gender and the Constitution, Women in India. 11.5 Development Planning in India. 11.7, 11.6 The CSWI's Critic and Parliamentary Mandate. 11.7 Post-Emergency Planning of Women Development. 11.8 The 6th Plan Unit on Women and Development. 11.9 The 7th 5-Year Plan 1985 to 90. 11.10 The 8th 5-Year Plan 1990 to 97. Then 11.11 The 9th 5-Year Plan, that is from 1997 to 2000. 11.1 to 12 Policy and Planning for Women, and 11.13 Conclusion, and 11.14 Further Reading. Learning objectives. In this unit, we will critically analyze and understand the importance of gender perspective in development, gender perspectives and development planning in India, and policies and strategies which address gender issues. 11.1 Introduction. The unit on gender perspective on development is a continuation of our previous unit, which is on social and human development. The human development approach goes beyond growth as an indicator of development to assessing other more important indicators which directly address the issue of well-being and empowerment. It asks for questions: who gets what from development process? This unit to address the same questions with reference to women. Though women constitute nearly half of the total human population, their share in the fruits of development is abysmally low. This low status has raised the issues what development ought to be. Gender perspective, it is felt, has been to be an integral part of any development process. Women have always been a part of survival of any community. Not only have they taken up the primary responsibility of rearing the young and integrating them into the ways of society, they have also worked towards the fulfillment of the everybody needs of the family and the community. Women cook, clean, wash, gather food and fuel, till land, work is in offices as labor, etc. However, only some of their works is acknowledged. This has been the root problem of looking at women as separate entities and not as an integral part of the development process. With increasing debates on these women's issues, there have been an acknowledgement for the need to add a gender perspective into the development discourse. In this unit, we will address issues related to this. We will also look at the Indian scenario and examine various planning initiatives to see how far we have reached in making women as integral part of development discourse. Before we go on to that, we will first try and understand what we mean by the term gender. 11.2 The concept of gender. When we use the term male and female, we commonly refer to the anatomical difference between these two sexes. When we use the word gender, however, we are going beyond anatomical or biological differences between male and female to their socially constituted roles and status. For example, when one uses the word femininity, the social expectations of feminine qualities may be nurturing, caring and delicate, irrational, intuitive, submissive, non-aggressive, etc. When a woman does not meet these social expectations of feminine attributes, she may be considered not female enough or transgressing her role either as a daughter, mother or sister, all of which have some role expectations. These roles, as you might be aware, are socially conditioned and arise of structures of power. In a patriarchal setup, the entire system is geared towards keeping women at a lower level. The tilt of power and status in such situations, institutional differentiations clearly favors the male, with the establishment of asymmetrical relationship of domains. However, despite such divisions being almost universal, nuisance and impacts of gender varies significantly across situations and contexts. As a variable of social stratification, gender has to be analyzed in associations with other variables like class, race, ethnicity and caste. Gender relations contribute to the social meaning of female and male and thus depend on the consideration of appropriate behavior and activity for women and men. The focus of gender in practice in a social role and the nature of interactions between women and men. The valid understanding then is that gender relations are also social relations and not biological or natural. When we assessing development with differences to women, we are in essence trying to understand this gender aspect of women. Having understood the term gender, let us now look at how women issue came up in the developing discourse. Gender is one of the key terms of social analysis. It is important to understand the social, economic, political and cultural forces that determine how men and women participate in and benefit from the development process. Box 11.1. Simone de Beauvoir's of Second Sex. In her book Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir, a French writer and feminist, wrote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological or psychological economic state determine the figure that the human female present in society. It is civilization as a whole that produces this creature intermediate between male and image, which is described as feminine. Only the feminine, only the intervention of someone else can establish as an individual as another. Like all other social relations, gender relationships are also affected by and have an effect on how societies and economies change over time. The process of socialization and social relations of production have a distinct impact on the location of human lives across countries and regions. 11.3. Women, Gender and Development. Much of the formative intersection between the ideas of feminism and women in development took place during the context of UN Decade of Women 1976 to 85. Equality, Development and Peace was the slogan that was proposed at the International Women's Year Conference in Mexico City in 1975. Equality was seen as an issue that came from industrialized West, peace from the Eastern Bloc, and development as a key issue that concerned Third World women. What exactly constituted key men's issues was constantly being debated, and it was eventually realized that women's issues should not be kept as a separate section. See box 11.2 for more details. Box 11.2 Emerging Issues in UN Decade of Women 1976 to 85. Women are proposing new visions of development towards which several international meetings in the late 1970s and 1980s made public declaration about feminist visions of development for a global perspective. Following are some of the major international meetings with their vision and plan. Asian and Pacific Center for Women and Development, APCWD 1979, held in Bangkok, was sponsored by UN. It proposed one of the first global definitions of feminism as an ideology with two long-term goals: the achievement of women's equality, dignity and freedom of choice through women's power to control their own lives within the outside and the home, to the removal of all forms of inequality and oppressions through the creation of more just social and economic order nationally and internationally. One of the paramount goals of feminist vision of development was empowerment of women. Workshop on Development Strategies for the Future, Feminist Perspective, 1980, held in Stony Point, New York. It approached development as a political process and stated dissatisfaction with limited definition of development, which confined itself to economic indices such as GDP. It asked for integrationist approach and empowerment of women. Dhaka Declaration on Another Development with Women in 1982 was held in Senegal. The declaration believed that the most fundamental and underlying principle of another development should be that of structured transformation, a notion which challenges the economic, political and cultural forms of domination at the national, international and household level. Nairobi end of the UN Decade World Conference in 1985, a Third World Women's Group was formed to define the issues of development from the vantage point of women. dawn development alternatives with women for a new era. It called for cultural diversity of women's movement and issues, but a structural unity in trying to understand subordination. It emphasized the active involvement of women in structural transformations and deep commitment to self-reliance, which rests on indigenous culture rather than on Western models. It is this continuous realization of women's integral role in development process that brought into concepts such as women in development. The Women in Development (WID) approach promotes women's integrations in development efforts by focusing on women, looking at how the process of development has made an impact on the position of women in society. The study of women in development focus upon development and the economics of development, that is, the distribution of economic benefit rather than its growth singularity. The key questions in such context is essential: who gets what? Indicators of human development shows that women have an unequal share in the process of development, and they are often endowed with the negative development merits. When resources are stretched, then it is women, the most marginalized in the first place, who suffers first and most. Women have the smallest share of the resources pie in the world. When its pie shrinks, women's losses are greatest. The World Bank early women in development programs tended to treat women as a special target group of beneficiary in the various projects and programs. However, a major criticism of women in development approach is that it treats women as beneficiaries. It starts from the premise that the women has been excluded from development. But women's time, energy, work and skill and involvement in easy aspect of development process. It is inequality of gender relations and the counting of subordination of women that ensures that women's contribution is not matched by recognition and remuneration in social, political and economic terms. The problem with the women in development approach is that it targets women in order to make them a part of mainstream development while ignoring the fact that the women are already in intrinsic part of the development process. Women are always there. The understanding of women's free labor is that there is no need to compensate it, and subsequently there is no cost in terms of resource allocated. The real picture, however, is that the female domestic labor provides a critical and necessary support, enabling the male workforce and society to function. Women's role in society is a combination of productive and reproductive roles. Women's productive role includes all tasks that enhance the income and economy of the household and the community. Example: crop, livestock production, handicrafts production, marketing and wage employment. Reproductive activities are those carried out to reproduce and care for the household and community, including the activities involved in fuel and water collection, food preparation, childcare, education, healthcare and home maintenance. These activities tend to be viewed as a non-economic, generally carried no monetary compensation, and are usually out of the budget of the national income accounts. Women's role in society in reality is life-sustaining. According to Sen and Crown 1988, in every society, women's daily invisible efforts to feed, clothe and nurture their families are the functions that sustain their communities. The reality of social reproduction derives from a sexual division of labor that is tied to gender division and male dominance. While sex is a physical distinctions, gender is social and cultural. Mogadam finds that the division of labor between men and women is a matter of gender roles and not sexual roles, determined by culture rather than by sex, and the key to understanding the division of labor pattern is in the culture rather than in human psychology, physiology or anatomy. Moreover, culture is not a constant but a variable with the extent of its impact depending on factors like the depth and scope of development, state policy, class and social structure. While a women in development refers to the current situations of people, it tends to demarcate the women as a separate practice area. The frame of women development has been supplanted by that of the gender and development since the late 1980s. The later broadens the scope of interventions to include systematic relations of inequality involving the relations between both men and women. Together with a critical look at the India development perspective, process and the underlying assumption, the gender and development approach to policy framework includes modalities of reflecting the way in which men and women relations, constraints, or advance efforts to boost the growth. The gender empowerment approach, as defined by the European Commission 1993, identifies women's participation in decision making. It seeks to increase self-reliance and self-confidence so that they will become more active players in society. Gender empowerment readdresses the imbalance in status of women through affirmative actions to improve the quality of women's lives. Reflections and action 11.1. Women, as we have been mentioning, have been always worked for the survival and the need of family and the larger community and society. Yet they are paid wages or salaries for only some of the work that they are engaged in. Given this state of affairs, attempt the following activities. Make a list of work that women do for which they are not paid any wages. To make this list, we encourage you to also actively observe the women who do this work in your everyday settings and talk to them about how they feel about their work. Based on their observation, you talk with the women, write a report on women's work and share it with your fellow students or coordinator or teacher. 11.4 Gender and the Constitution. Women in India. There is a growing citizens against the top-down approach and the growth-oriented development perspectives, as they fail to consider the women as an integral part of development, and they continue to add to the growing inequalities between the haves and have-nots. Women being the have-nots. Let us see in what way India has been addressing women and development. To get a sense of where we are, we need to understand where the foundations are, and for what we will first examine the constitutional guarantees, and in our next section in the planning and policy issues with regard to women. The underlying principle of the gender role presumed by the Indian states are embodied in the Indian Constitution, which is foremost among the basic document which declares the intentions of the Indian state. The primary imperatives of women's equality is rooted in Part 3, Fundamental Rights of Constitution. The sub-article of Art 15 dealing with the right to equality lays down, the state shall not discriminate against any citizens or grounds only for religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth, or any of them. Further, the Constitution in the same article at sub-article 3 lays down, nothing in this article shall prevent the state from making any special provision for women and children. The Constitution thus gives equal status to women and citizens, while also taking into consideration some of special disabilities which the state may come forward to rectify through affirmative action. Para 4 of the Constitution of India, dealing with the directive principles of state policy, has reference to the principles to be taken into account by the state wherein concern for women is exhibited. Article 39, 40-44 refers to a certain principle which may not be enforceable in the courts of law but provide guidance to the state treating women as equal citizens. However, certain other sections of the constitutions, like the right to freedom of religion as embodied in Article 25-28 as interpreted by the state legislated in the form of personal laws, fundamentally deny equality to women in almost all basic facets of her life. They deny equality in personal, economic, sexual, social, educational, cultural, and even with regard to her rights to body, as well as with regards to hold certain beliefs, values, and norms and codes of personal conduct. Further, the economic conception embodied in the Constitution as formulated in Article 23 and 24 in the fundamental rights, dealing with the right against exploitation, does not consider the day-to-day immense and incessant appropriation of surplus labor of women witnessed in every family as an exploitation, not to mention how women invariably are paid less for their work than men. Right to freedom of religion and right against exploitations are fundamentally discriminatory against women, and while not agreeing to designate women's labor at the home as exploitation, it has been supportive of gender bias of the state. The state permissions to personal religious laws permits the world on religious prescriptions of very discriminatory norms and practices towards women. Personal law orient towards the domestic private space. The Constitution mostly addresses itself to the public sphere. Personal laws having implications on the private life. Essentially, family life has a holistic implication for shaping women's status, position, rights and obligation in society. The relegation of women in the private sphere through personal laws has transformed the entire issues of gender justice and development into individualized and limited pathologies to be dealt with by specialized bodies. The manner in which the social policies discriminate against women and prescribe certain tasks and behavior of development reveals the essence and values that are the guiding factors of the state. Underlying of what women consciousness should be in concert with the state definition of femininity, and this definition of femininity is not marginal but absolutely central to the purposes of welfareism. Reflections and Action 11.2. We have a series of maintenance and post provisions that had been incorporated in our constitution that attempt to raise the social status of women in India, as well as a number of legislations which have been enacted. In what way you do think these constitutional provisions and enactment has helped to raise women's status in India? Illustrate your answers in an example from your own life's experience. 11.5. Development planning in India. Early development planning in India since 1950s identified social welfare services as the only category which tackled problems of women among the other target groups. Such an approach was the outcome of the understanding of women as a category of whom special and separate programs, services, safeguards, etc. were put in place. Social welfare services target to reach out to vulnerable groups divided into several categories. The Central Social Welfare Board, set up in 1953, was confronted with the odorous problems of the lack of any government machinery, and for welfare-related activities it undertook the task of promoting welfare through voluntary organization. It also encouraged women's organizations to take up such activities in partnership with the government. As part of this strategy, women's organizations were promoted, especially those working with the grassroots. Mahila Mandals were promoted as a delivery mechanism for essential services like education, health, especially for maternal and child health, both by the CSWB and the community development programs through the first and the second 5 years plans. According to Veena Manjundar, this combination of institutions building and women resource development was also expected to prepare women to participate in political and development process. Thus, through the language of these strategies reflected contemporary meanings of welfare, there was a conceptual thrust, even though inadequately articulated, towards actively involving and stimulating to the participation of women's organization in the process of change. However, increasing bureaucratic control, top-down designing and streamlining of programs, and declining resource support to organizational and institutional development from below both reflected and contributed to the low priority and non-serious approach to basic issues in promotion of gender equality. The third, fourth, and fifth year plans saw a decline in support to strategies organizing, building, and human development. The report of National Committee of Women's Education 1958 to 59 saw some priority being accorded to women's education. From the period of the third plan, there was a distinct rise in priority according to the issues of population control. Directives from the Planning Commission from fourth plan onwards failed to integrate family planning and maternal and child health planning for supplementary nutrition of children and nursing, and expectant mothers from poverty groups are not integrated with MCH. The Community Development Programs 1952 was another significant step in the early years of development planning. It aimed at the decentralized development in the rural areas through community efforts. In the sections to follow, let us look at the various plan, strategies, and policies to see how and what place women had in the development process. 11.6. The CSW's critics and parliamentary mandate. In the year 1970, the Ministry of Education and Social Welfare, Government of India, appointed a committee called Committee on the Status of Women in India to study the status of women in India. The ministry was acting on an UN request for a status of women report for International Women's Year 1975. The committee had two tasks: to examine the constitutional and legal and administrative provisions that have a bearing on the social status of women, their education and employment, and second, to assess the impact of these provisions. The committee came to the conclusion that there was an increase in the marginalization of women in the economy and society. In the CSWI report towards equality in 1974 found demographic trends of declining sex ratio, disparities in the life expectancy and death rates between men and women, and the difficulties involved in women's access to literacy, education, and livelihood. It was of the view that the Indian state had failed in its constitutional responsibility of gender equality. The planning process of the development in the agriculture industry, fishery, livestock, etc., and other important sectors of Indian economy contained no acknowledgement of the millions of women involved in these sectors due to livelihood reasons. This process of marginalization of large majority of women in the economy, together with their neglect and devaluation by the society with the support of the state, definitely demonstrated gender bias. The increasing investment on education, health, and the opening of public employment opportunities that benefited a very small section of the female population. These privileged sections of women were again threatened by escalation of social practices like dowry, inequality meted out as a consequence of the personal laws, the non-enforcement of the existing laws, which sought to offer protection to women like the labor laws of criminal laws, and lack of women's overall visibility in the sense of the inclusion of their needs, concerns, and perspectives in the planning process. Even though the parliamentary debate on the Towards Equality report sought the removal of all disabilities that Indian women continued to suffer from, the declaration of national emergency in 1974 to 75 within a few weeks after it was have been tabled in the parliament pushed back any serious action on the CSWI recommendation. 11.7 Post-emergency planning of women's development 1977-80. The period between 1970 and 1980 witnessed significant policy reviews exercised by the government. Among them were the report of the Working Group on Employment of Women, report of the Working Group on Employment of Village Level Organization of Rural Women 1977 to 78, report of the National Committee on the Role of and Participation of Women in Agriculture and Rural Development 1997 to 1979 to 80. These reviews exercise constituted a substantive base to the conceptualizing the fundamental problems and strategies of women's development in India. The Indian Agenda of Women's Development got incorporated into the United Nations Mid-Decade Program of Action, mediated through the Non-Alignment Movements. Special Conference on Women and Development in Baghdad 1970. India gained memberships on Commission on the Status of Women in 1970 to 80, and the Preparatory Committee of Mid-Decade Copenhagen Conference in 1980, and the Program of Action. India's contribution to the emphasis on the Third World perspectives on development was acknowledged during the Mid-Decade Conference, and there was the consequent adoption of employment, health, and education as a sub-theme of the decade's agenda. Veena Manjundar's examination of the conceptual approach and roll through these viewers identified women's development needs as having multiple dimensions and cutting across economic and social and political sectors, requiring explicit explanation of the women's situation on various sectors. She called for earmarking of a share of various sectors allocations of women, instead limiting it to the women-specific program or agencies. She also called for promotion of rural employment and development through the women collective organizations such as Seva, etc., which are paving the way towards such path. The 6 5-year plan released in December 1979 marked a new beginning, as it included a separate unit of women. Till this time, women's concerns were always subsumed under sectorial approaches in health, education, rural development, agriculture, etc. This unit was a first attempt as a holistic planning for women. It stated that the objective of the population control could not be achieved without bringing about major changes in the status of women. This plan suggested that the need for administrative innovation and the collection of sex-wise distribution of data on development assistance, thereby urging the better information together with the mechanism to ensure women receiving their due share of government attentions and support and equal opportunity for growth and distributive justice. These principles of women's involvement in the planning process also sought to extend support for organization of rural women similar to organization of rural poor in efforts to improve their bargaining power and access to development assistance. However, the new planning commission set up in 1980s reverted women back to the social services and put on hold the outward-looking strategies, approaches, and perspectives developed for women. However, the intervention at this stage by the National Working Women's Organization made a definite impact upon the planning process. A period of partnership began between the few cells on women that had been set up within the Ministries of Labour and Employment, Social Welfare and Rural Development, and the growing women's movement and the women's studies scholars. 7 women's organizations got together to submit a joint memorandum in 1980s gathered support from women members of the parliament and thereby persuaded the planning commissions to incorporate a unit of women and development in the 6th plan. This was a landmark achievement in India's planning history. 11.8. The 6th plan, Unit on Women and Development. The Unit on Women and Development acknowledged women's lesser status in the society and traced it to the inadequate opportunities of independent employment and income, and demographic trends, higher mortality, lower economic participation, literacy, sex ratio, etc. It defined a multi-pronged but interdependent strategy for women's development which would be depend on the total development process. Regarding cases of transferred assets such as agricultural and homestead land, the redistribution policies of the government promised that the government shall endeavour to provide joint title to husbands and wife. It also advocated strengthening of the grassroots women's voluntary organization, which were envisioned as a channel for women to participate effectively in decisions that affect their lives and promoting educate development efforts for women at different levels. For education, special support services were to expand women's access to all types of education. The institutions of women's quota and magic figure 1/3 made it first ever appearance within the Trisomy program. The 6th plan also proposed corrective measures in sectors where women's employment is low or on the decline. 11.9. The 7th 5th year plan 1985 to 90. The 7th 5-year plan is emphasis provision for gainful employment to women and youth. It reiterated the strategies of organizing women around socio-economic activities in order to succeed in the twin objective of making their project economically viable and also adding social strengths to enhance their overall status. For the first time, there was a use of feminist language as against the predominantly patriarchal preference to confine women to an oppressive environment. In Unit 14 of the actual plan document, this period that coincided with the Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's gruesome association was a period of change within the government. It was, however, a period of optimism for women's cause both inside and outside the government. The Government of India hosted the second NAM Conference on Women and Development to offer inputs into the end of decade UN conference, which was to be held at Nairobi. India's approach was both official and unofficial at the ILO-sponsored Afro-Asian Conference on Rural Women Organization and Development earned encouraging appreciation. The development of rural development announced in 30% quota for women in anti-poverty programs for rural areas. Steps were taken to initiate gender sensitization as a mandatory part of training of rural development officials. The new government at the center formed a full development of women and child development under the Ministry of Human Resources, include the development of education, culture, sports and youth affairs among women. Pressures from the women's movement and internal struggle within the government led to the incorporation of 2 paragraphs of education for women's equality with the National Policy of Education. For the first time, a message appeared that together with expanding women's access to all kinds of education, the system with all its institutions had to shoulder a major responsibility for genuine empowerment of women, though change in the social construction of gender. Yet another breakthrough this plan period was the issue of effective representation of women in Panchayati Raj institutions. Initially, CSWI's recommendation in this regard had been shelved. Efforts were made to begin a debate on whether by the Secretary Social Welfare Form from 1985. The result took shape in 2 years' time. Preparation for a national perspective, women and child development. The National Commission for Self-Employment, Women 9 NSSCW, was set up to articulate the problem needed to the aspirants of working women in their poverty sector. In NPP, wanted to an increase in women's participation and presence of decision-making levels in local level government agency bodies, state assemblies and parliament, and suggested 30% reservation at all these levels. The NPP was heavily critiqued by the women's movements. Finally, in 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments came out 1992. They conferred constitutional status on these bodies, mandated regular elections, wider powers, resources, and reserved one other third of seats for women at various levels of the local bodies. On the issues of reservation for women, the women's movement organized rejected suggestions of nominations to build up a critical mass as undemocratic and subversive of the constitution. They also rejected reservation in state assemblies and parliament. However, in the case of panchayatis and municipalities, demand was made for the achievement of a critical mass which would throw up a new leadership and new concerns from the more marginalized sector. 11.10 8th 5-year plan 1990-97. Part 1 of the plan document mentions women only in the context of the need for population control. In Part 1 of the sectoral units mentioned is made of women only in context of women-specific programs. The principles of a women's quota or a earmark share of allocations are not mentioned. The new features in the section of women's development include a paragraph of violence against women and a 2-page situational analysis which highlighted the problems of higher mortality, lower education, and increasing unemployment of women. The conceptual, methodological, and perception base regarding women values of women's work computed by women's concentration in the formal sector, resulting in casualization, non-protection of labor laws, and inaccessibility to credit, technology, and other types of development assistance. The girl child got a paragraph from the first time with the promise of special programs. The National Commission of Women's Act was passed in 1990, whereby the Autonomous National Commission for Women was set up through an enactment act to act as a statutory ombudsman for women, reviewing laws and policies and intervening selectivity in individual cases of violations and denial of women's rights. In 1991, National Plan of Action for the Girl Child set up time-bound recommendations at the survival, protection, development, and participation of girl child, with emphasis on non-discrimination and the university and the invisibility of rights. The draft National Policy on Empowerment of Women 1996 put together policy directive for securing gender justice and gender equality and for maintaining the gender consideration. 11.11 The 9th 7-year plan 1997 to 2000. The 9th plan had important objectives for women. The approach paper of the 9th plan focused on the issues of empowerment of women, discrimination, decentralization, and people's participations in planning and implementation strategy. From the first time in the history of planned commission in India, the empowerment of women was adopted as one of the objectives in the 9th plan. The approach paper also declared a strategy of drawing up a women's component plan for every sector, which would identify the inflow of benefit to women and carrying out a gender appraisal of past performance in this sector. In the field of development, for the first time, the need for reservation of seats for women in parliament and the state legislative assemblies were discussed. The planning proposed to ensure 30% representations of women in the public sector and provides for a larger entry for women in the premier civil services. In the field of health, emphasis would be used to be in reproductive health. In education, besides gender equality plan would be initiated for free education of girls into the college level and greater vocational training for them. To increase the women's participation in the industrial development of the country, the plan proposes to set up a development bank for women entrepreneurs for assisting them in the small and tiny sector. In the agriculture, a greater assistance and share was called upon through rural development, employment, etc. The most important resolve of the plan was to have a special women's competent in the plan to ensure 30% of the flow of funds to women development sectors. Reflections and action 11.3. How are governmental policies and plans different from civil society initiatives like NGOs with regards to women's issues and development? List 5 government initiated efforts that have been helping women's cause in India. 11.12. Policy and planning for women. A review of policy formulations and planning of women's development in India reflects the lack of efforts in planning and policy formations of women in the states. There is a very little conceptualization regarding women's needs and the necessary formulation required to give them a larger share of development. Only a few states of India have policies for women's development. The efforts are inadequate to do not meet the requirement initially and do not meet the requirements initially have come mostly from the central government. For a federal state that India is, the success of any development process is a far cry unless the state governments fully realize their responsibility to raise the status of women. Greater involvement of grassroots organizations through the political process would be done on the mechanism for the achievement of women empowerment. Further, her gender equality to be fully achieved, it has to be integrated with all development programs of the country. 11.13 Conclusion. Though the various sections in these units were learned, the concept of gender and the places of women in development perspectives both in general as well as Indian context. We have seen how the gender empowerment approach identifies women's participations in decision making as the key to success. Its goal is to increase self-reliance and self-confidence so that the women become active players in society. Incorporations of gender into the development process acknowledges that women and men experience development differently according to their social position, race, class, colonial history, etc. Structural and situation are required to be addressed at a multiple levels so as to ensure that women gain increased access and control over the critical materials and non-material resources. Further, the focus of gender-based development is on the gender relationship that determine the existence inequalities, measure inequalities. Measures include credit, training, skills, and resource needed for productive decision making processes and community power together. Development of women implies their access, its overcoming the underlying structural inequalities. Gender in development is the approach that seeks to readdress women's status through affirmative action in improving the qualities of women's life. 11.14 Further reading. Tim Allen and Ellen Thomas, 1990, Poverty and Development in Oxford University, West Oxford. Seth Mira, 2001, Women and Development in India Experience, Sage Publications, New Delhi. This is the end of the Unit 11. Thank you very much.